Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. So how much easier is it to wake up these days?
A lot easier. A lot easier. I don't get up in the dark anymore. So that's a plus, for sure. There's a big difference getting up at 4:30 versus getting up when I do get up. But I do have the commute over here. So that's in the minus column. But there are very few things in the minus column, I have to say.
Over here, by the way, is Santa Monica, specifically under the cafeteria of Santa Monica College, where KCRW-FM has its storied studios. I'm Colin Marshall. This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. Today I'm speaking with Madeleine Brand, a beloved Los Angeles radio personality who right now hasn't just started, but in January debuted with a show on KCRW called Press Play. You may know her from a variety of other shows, such as, on NPR, she was on Morning Edition, All Things Considered. She was on Day to Day as a co-host. You might know her from her days when she was waking up at 4:45 in the morning on KPCC for the Madeleine Brand Show, or from her time on KCET's SoCal Connected on television. But now we're here at KCRW. We can talk about this show. What's different about noon radio than morning radio, besides having to not get up so early?
Well, I think the audience is expecting something different at noon than they are expecting at 9 a.m. when my previous show aired. At 9 a.m., I think, especially in Los Angeles, you're still wanting to know if the world is spinning. So you do more hard news at 9 a.m. than at 12 necessarily. I think at 12, people have a general sense already what the big stories of the day are, and they kind of checked in with their feeds or checked in online in some way or listened to radio. And I think 12 noon is a time when you can actually have a little more freedom to explore issues and ideas and take an unexpected perspective on stories of the day. And here at KCRW, I think what we do really well is culture. And so we're able to investigate a lot more cultural issues and do a lot more stories along those lines.
The new show Press Play has a format that seems like it has a lot of traction in Los Angeles, but I don't know what to call it. It's host talks to a variety of people about what's going on. Is there a name for this format? I mean, it's successful in Los Angeles in your show and others, but I can't think of anything other than to say, one host talks to this person, then that person, then that person, then that person, each about their own thing, which is in the news that day.
Yeah, I guess.
It's hardly catchy, though. It's not. There's no elevator pitch there.
It's not. Yeah, it's more than 6 words or so.
Yes.
I guess, how would you describe it? It's a cultural and public affairs or news show. See, I'm having a problem describing it myself. I think it's basically what we try to do with it is try to figure out what would interest the most amount of people who live here in Los Angeles who are already curious, interested in the news, and already have like a news basis so that you don't have to do the basic stuff, and don't want if it bleeds, it leads kind of stuff. But they want a more thoughtful, sometimes irreverent, deeper look at some of the issues. Not to say that we wouldn't do just a straight up news story. Like today we led with something on the VA because during the mid-morning, the president spoke about the VA crisis. So we led with that. That's sort of the obvious lead. But then we came out of that by doing a piece where I interviewed someone who had written an essay about going to the new World Trade Center Museum, the Memorial Museum, and he lost a sister. And he talked about walking through this museum and experiencing the exhibits in it from the perspective of someone who was actually personally affected by it, knowing full well that this museum was not made for him, that it was made for people who did not lose anyone, but yet felt compelled to go because they were affected because it was a national tragedy. And so we talked about what these museums are for, these kinds of museums, like a Holocaust museum or a war memorial, and who they're meant to attract, and and how they're meant to comfort people and who they're meant to comfort. And whether or not they're appropriate or not, whether or not a gift shop in this museum is appropriate.
Yes,
and
there's been some talk about that, I understand.
Yeah, right. And so that's the kind of thing that I really love to do. And this is more about talking about an issue that is in the news, but from a more personal perspective or a more thoughtful perspective.
That challenge of finding things to talk about that would interest the most amount of people in Los Angeles, it seems like Los Angeles, of all cities in the world, is the one that makes that the hardest, of finding an interest that unites the people of Los Angeles. Do you think that's true? It seems like it'd be easier anywhere but Los Angeles than to find something that interests even like a plurality of the people here. You know what I mean? Because of the size and diversity and Lord knows what else complicating things here.
Yeah, well, you can't appeal to everyone all the time, that's for sure, which is why we have a variety of stories on the show. But, I have to look at it through my own perspective and my own prism too, and using my own experience, because I've been doing this for a long time. I can't pretend to know if this does interest everybody in Los Angeles. In fact, I'm quite sure it doesn't. I just have to trust that what we're doing here is interesting. And it's kind of like a leap of faith. And I don't know how you measure it, really. I really don't. I just know that if I think we did a good job, if I'm interested, then I hope other people are. It's one of those things. I don't know. Like, why do people like certain music or TV shows or films? It is a personal preference to a certain degree, and you just hope that a lot of people share your personal preference.
It's not that bad a gauge, your internal gauge, because you're often billed as being a native Angelino. How long did you actually spend in that first stretch of Angelino-hood?
of my life?
Exactly, yeah. Well, you of course came back from the East Coast to do radio here about a decade ago now, right? Mm-hmm. So tell me that the very first stretch, birth onward in Los Angeles, how long was that?
Well, I was born here in Hollywood, and I spent, about the first 10 years of my life living here exclusively. And then I moved up to Northern California, but I would come back and visit once a month or so. Right. So I always had my foot in Los Angeles as I was growing up. And then I went to school at UC Berkeley. Right.
So maybe the most Northern California school there is. Probably.
Well, I think so.
Not the northernmost, but the most Northern California-ish. I mean, do you agree with that it is the most...
Oh, I see what you mean.
The center of Northern Californianess in academia?
Not physically.
Yes, right. I guess there's probably one up near up in the state of Jefferson, yes?
Humboldt, right, up there. And
Tell me, how much does your persona today on the air differ from Madame Baum in Berkeley?
Wow, you've done your research. Well, that was more of a college DJ period of my life.
On the Berkeley station, which was called what?
KALX. KALX.
How classically college radio-y a station was that?
Well, let's just say I'm having some flashbacks sitting right here. Because
you are under a college.
I know. And then we were in there's a similar vibe to it. Right. It was classic college radio station. It was in an old ramshackle house right off the campus.
A house? That's another level entirely.
Oh, my gosh. Creaky house. And then the studios were actually downstairs, much like this. It felt like you were in a basement. Maybe it was a basement, actually. It was just classic. There were records everywhere. There were people lounging around, people who probably graduated 20 years previously who are still there as DJs. And it was very free form. But it was great. It was great training. And we did some great news there, if you can believe it or not. It was just during the anti-apartheid movement, the protests, which were a big deal at the UC campus. They were calling on the regions to divest from companies that did business with South Africa. And they staged these large sit-ins on campus, and we covered it. We were the only radio station to be right there and covering it. So that was really exciting, and so that really whet my appetite.
Your appetite for radio as a medium or sort of news gathering?
For both. For both. I mean, I kind of fell into the radio thing. You just experiment when you're in college and try to figure out what you like.
That's what they say, isn't it?
And you just, you try things out and see if you like it. And I did. I really liked it. And, I don't think I realized until later the import of radio as a particular medium for delivering information. I didn't really figure that out until I'd been in it for a while, how important it is to people who are regular listeners, because there is something unique in the actual experience of listening to a story rather than reading it or watching it on television. It's much more intimate.
Were you already a kind of fan of radio, or was this something you discovered by actually doing it?
I think it was actually doing it. I listened to the radio because I was in the car with my parents driving around, as a kid. So you just sort of just listen to the news. It's not, I don't think most kids really want to listen to the news.
Probably not.
But it was always there in the background. And I think what was more appealing to me was the storytelling part of it. Because I was an English major and I was always drawn to that. And so I think that's what really got me hooked.
Do you think, people talk about this all the time, but do you think Los Angeles has an unusually close relationship with the radio as a medium, more so than even New York or San Francisco?
I do, because people are in the car. Sure. New York is the largest market, however, for still radio, but I never got the response anywhere. I've worked in a lot of places than I've gotten here in terms of people just knowing who's on the radio and being loyal and being into it. And it's interesting.
How long did you spend away on the East Coast? How long were you at a distance from Los Angeles?
I was on the East Coast for a long time, maybe 20 years or so.
Where on the East Coast were you?
New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., Buffalo, New York.
All the big ones.
And don't forget Newark, New Jersey.
Of course. The fifth point of the star. How quick... I was going to say, how quick do you become sort of East Coastified? But is that a thing that happens? Do people get East Coastified when they go over there?
I did. I do.
So what does that mean to have been East Coastified to you?
That's a great question. What does it mean to be East Coastified? For me, I just have this affinity for New York. I love it. Loved it, love it. I don't know if it's in the past tense. But
well, do you still love it?
I do, but I don't live there anymore.
Right.
And so it's a different relationship. Maybe I'm thinking more about it in the past when I did live there. I visit, but it's not the same thing. But when I was there, I really got into it. I really loved it. And I thought I'd never leave. I was one of those people. You know how there are New Yorkers who come here and they're more Los Angelinos than anyone else?
Yes. They do. Some do. It's like the Englishmen. They go native sometimes like that, right?
Exactly. Well, that's how I was with New York.
Oh, what about it? What about it was something you had sought out in the sort of human experience so that New York delivered finally?
Well, I think it delivers the excitement and the visceral humanity, and it was something completely different than what I had known and what I had grown up with. Just seeing all these different people crammed into one place and the sense of history, I think I also really liked. I liked going to these neighborhoods and meeting people who had lived there forever and their families had lived there forever and all the ethnic diversity. And of course it's here in Los Angeles, but you have to seek it out. And, I think it's in your face all the time, and I found that really interesting. And also, obviously, the cultural offerings are unparalleled.
Right. I think back, not that far back, to a launch party for your show Press Play that I was at a fancy house over in Larchmont, and you were doing a panel discussion about the film Her, the Spike Jonze film, with this very compelling, to many, myself included, vision of future Los Angeles, where it's sort of an extrapolation of what's already going on, where it's more built upward and more of a dense, there's elements, a lot of Shanghai brought in, but also it seems New Yorkish in parts. Does the inner New Yorker, your inner New Yorker, get excited by that prospect of Los Angeles's seeming future direction?
If it looked like Her, is that what you're asking?
Well, it's not going to look like Her, but Her is built upon some trends you can see. More building more densely, more people clustering a bit more tightly, sort of a move away from what Los Angeles has been in the past, of trying to get away from other people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So does your inner New Yorker thrill to that at all?
Yeah, it does if there's public transportation to go along with it.
Well, there's that being built as well. So that's almost the most visible part of it.
Right, right. I mean, public transportation we can all use easily. Right. So that's another big leap. It does and it doesn't. I feel really conflicted about it. I really do, because I grew up here, and part of, again, the nostalgia, I have nostalgia for New York, I have nostalgia for the LA that I grew up in, was that sense of peace and openness and quiet that I really love in LA. The fact that you can be in the wilderness in the middle of the city is just incredible. And that's what I really like about it. So I mean, not that they're going to raise Griffith Park to make room for high rises, but, I like the fact.
Too many coyotes there. It's dangerous.
They would mount a protest for sure. They would hold cats for ransom. But it is thrilling to think of that, and I really love going downtown and seeing everything there and walking around downtown. I mean, it's kind of funny walking around in downtown. You almost feel like you're walking around in New York, and then you've got the light that tells you differently. Yes. And it doesn't.
There's a few signals, aren't there?
A few signals, and it does seem a little shinier.
It's true, but it's one of those friends sometimes say the same thing, like, yeah, I get these New York-like moments in downtown Los Angeles, and I always wonder, well, nothing will ever be exactly like New York. Sometimes New York doesn't feel like it's exactly like New York. But Los Angeles, you get to see it. You get to see Los Angeles change. I mean, you've seen Los Angeles change quite a bit, given when you first lived here, and now it's not that long a span of time for a city to change in, but it has changed a lot, I would assume. New York changes in its way, but it remains fundamentally the same, does it not?
Yeah.
Everything's always changing in New York, but New York is always, in some grander sense, the same. Does that make sense?
Right. And I think New York always has a sense that it is New York.
Right.
Los Angeles doesn't have that same sense.
That's what I like about Los Angeles. You've pinned it down.
Yeah, yeah. It's a city that still hasn't defined itself in rock, which is nice on the one hand, but also gives rise to feelings of insecurity that I sense. You know, who are we? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to be like New York with these dense, like a dense megalopolis, or are we supposed to be this free and easy, spread out metropolis that was once the ideal? And I think we can be both. I think we can be both, which is what it's also great about being here, is you can have it both ways. I was just talking to someone today about it. I had interviewed this writer, and she had come out from New York, and she moved out of the city to move upstate. And we talked about the exact same thing, where it was, the thrill of New York, and you become this kind of person who's very fast talking and interested in a lot of things and always debating and talking. And there's a kind of neurosis with that, which I like. And you've become kind of a different person when you're here.
Do you sense that? Do you sense that in yourself, that you are very different from the New York Madeleine Brand?
No, not really. But I think, most people have different sides to themselves, and one side can flourish in one place and one side can flourish in another place more easily. And I think that my neurotic side loved being in New York. I'm not saying that I'm not neurotic now here in Los Angeles, but I think that I think my hippie side can rear its patchouli head without shame here.
Patchouli scented head, yes. This is something you'll probably have a perspective on. It seems to me that Los Angeles, because you can't tell where the borders of it are, or even what is Los Angeles, everybody has a different idea of what to include. It has this porous or almost non-border with the rest of the world. New York, if I lived there, I feel like maybe I would just enclose myself in New York and be perfectly content with that. But I feel like in Los Angeles, it's not an option. You kind of have to be, if you're thinking about Los Angeles, you kind of are thinking about the whole world. Does that make any sense at all? It sounds a bit grand, but there's not a lot of, I can't think of many Los Angeles only issues that don't get me talking about the wider world. Whereas if I talk about New York stuff, I could be potentially talking about just New York and be okay with that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. I think Los Angeles is always thinking of itself as in relation to other places. And I think that's what I mean by it doesn't have this sense of itself the way New York does. New York is one of those places like, take me or leave me, but this is who I am. And, I don't care if you don't like it. LA is always eager to please, it seems to me, and it has so many different constituencies it needs to please. So one could say there's no there, or one could say it's this incredibly interesting, diffuse place, full of a myriad of meanings and definitions, which is, I think, it's funny because LA gets slapped with this label of being fatuous and superficial, but I think that's almost a deeper way of defining itself, because it isn't prey to an easy kind of callow definition. It defies that, which I like.
Saying Los Angeles is shallow is a bit like saying everybody in New York is a jerk. It conceals something more interesting. People aren't actually 201 shallow or 201 a jerk in New York, but that does tell you something interesting about how life works in those places. That's those stereotypes, right?
Well, yeah, sure. And I always said that going to New York, people are really nice. Like they're the nicest people you ever meet are New Yorkers. They're always willing to help you. And
in part because of that stereotype, you think, oh, people are going to be New Yorkers. But then you get there, and if they're just regular nice, wow, they're super friendly here, right? Because of what I've heard. Or in Los Angeles, somebody read a book here. Oh my God, it's nothing like what I've heard.
Right, exactly. And you yourself, you work for the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other things. So you have that. You're intimately aware of that people are readers here, and love the printed page. The problem I have is there's not enough hours in the day. It's hard.
I know what you mean.
You have to keep up on everything, and then just to bring it back to the radio, that's what's one good thing about the radio and also the show and KCRW in general, not to get too PR-y about it, but it's about sort of making those kind of curatorial decisions so that you don't have to paw through all the stuff. And
you found one solution to part of the hours in the day problem. Have I heard right? Have you hired a driver to take you back and forth to the station, from the station to home? That's I like that if it's true.
It sounds a little snotty, but it's not. I'm going to say it's not snotty. He's like a Lyft driver, so it's not,
Is it literally a Lyft you call every day?
Well, it's a guy who works for Lyft.
I see.
So
I imagine it's one of those things where you'd be like, it's actually cheaper than you think. It's not any, like that kind of thing?
It's cheaper than you think, and then when you think of the 2 hours that I spend in the car, I'm working. So these are 2 working hours. So that's... It's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, I would be spending those 2 hours, doing that just at a desk. What's the difference doing it at a desk or doing it in a car?
Right. It's true. You asked me before recording why I don't have a car. And I guess I can answer, I can get a lot more done on the train or the bus, or if I'm on a bike, I'm exercising. So I can always count it as something. But, man, I was driving my girlfriend's car back from about here yesterday, and I really almost never drive a car, but sometimes I do take hers somewhere. If she wants me to go buy something after I record an interview. So I was driving back from actually Venice, and I was just like, this is hell. It wasn't even a bad drive. It was just slow. I was like, this feels like enslavement. I just was sitting there going in the just harsh linearity of the driving experience. And I can understand, usually I think if people complain about Los Angeles, I'm like, come on. None of these are problems. None of the things you're complaining about are real problems. Look at all this place has to offer. And then I realized if I was on the road like this for 2 hours a day to go a total of 18 miles, I would hate myself. I would hate the city. I would hate what my life had become. Everything sort of erases, and it's, I don't know. Tell me about, you talk about who you become in different cities. I like who I am in Los Angeles, but when I'm behind the wheel of a car, I can feel myself becoming an asshole. You know what I mean? Does that ring a bell?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's no, obviously I'm always going to be right in every situation if I'm behind the wheel of a car. I don't know why.
Yeah, no, that's definitely it. And that was the other thing. It's not only that I can get work done, but the stress of driving across town during rush hour every day is, if I can avoid it, I try to. It's just too much. I have a very stressful job. I also have 2 kids, and so there's a lot going on. And if I can just reduce the stress by a little bit, and I don't, and it's kind of a thing where, all right, so it's a lot of money, but I think it's worth it for your mental health.
Right. It makes sense. Thinking of the stress of doing a news show, a few years ago, actually just before I came to Los Angeles, but I was already in Southern California, I interned for one day at KPCC, the station you used to be on. And I would say it was a bad choice on everyone's part, myself included, to have me intern there. It wasn't on your show. It was a different show, but it was another newsy show. And it was, I remember going in and these four ladies said, stare at these headlines for a while. And I stared at the headlines, and it was the day that S&P devalued U.S. bonds, so everything was about that. And the stories that weren't about that were all about rape for some reason. And I was just watching these scroll by, and the hours passed, this wave of nihilism washed over me. I'm like, no one's going to want to listen to this tomorrow. No one's going to want to listen to this 10 years from now. What am I doing? Why am I here? I was having this freak out, and I'd had a lot of coffee and no food, and it was just awful. Which led me to understand that I don't know what a news story is. Like, I can't separate what is a news story from what are just the things people do in the world. So I ask you, Madeleine Brand, news professional, what is a news story?
That is a great question. What is a news story? Well, a news story by its definition has to be news.
Sure.
So it has to be something that's happening and something that's new. I look for stories that have, every story has a conflict in it. And that's not just news stories. That's
right.
Any good story has a conflict in it.
So it's a little like screenplay writing.
Mm-hmm. Or short story writing or anything. I mean, any story that you tell in a bar has to have a conflict. Right. Something to overcome, an obstacle, an opponent, what have you. So it has to be something that is, that's a good question. I used to teach journalism at Columbia, and what I would teach my students, and this was more of a documentary class, but the story has to make me care beyond the first sentence or two. There has to be more than one question that we want to have answered. And I don't know, it's kind of one of those things like, when you see it type of thing. But, the simple answer is news story is for the top of the hour a different definition than for a news show or a show like mine. There's a different definition.
So it's not any one thing. A news story is not a simple matter.
I don't think it is. I think, the easy answer is what's happening today will be the top of the news, right? These things happen today. The mayor held a press conference. This is what he said. There was a shooting. This is what happened. The weather is going to be this. The traffic is that. And there you have it. There is the top of the news for you. What we're doing is something else. We're trying to take something that's newsworthy and make it interesting and make it meaningful beyond those first 30 seconds.
It reminds me of a conversation I had a while ago with a fellow who is pretty well known in public radio in Los Angeles. And we're having lunch, and I said to him, sometimes I think these news hosts you hear sometimes aren't interested in what they're talking about. And he said, yeah, of course. As if I'd said, sometimes I think the sun doesn't rise in the west. Like, his assumption was, yeah, of course they're not interested.
It doesn't rise in the west.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
Okay.
Sometimes I think the sun doesn't rise in the west. Of course it doesn't. Sometimes I think these public radio news announcers don't care about they're not really interested. Of course they're not. Yeah, so he said it as if it was obviously a fact that news hosts are not going to be interested most of the time in what they're talking about, which seems like that's a condition your show does not fall victim to. So how do you get around, I guess, this prevalent condition of public radio news hosts not really being interested in what they're talking about?
Well, I think I only do stories I'm interested in.
Right. It's a simple answer, but so why this sense? I mean, is it? I mean,
look, there is a certain aspect of feeding the beast,
right.
And when you're doing, maybe he was just talking about top of the hour newscast. I don't know. I mean, that is pretty meh, It's reading headlines, doing 20-second readers. It's not that, deep or interesting. It needs to be done, though, because when you turn on the radio, you want to know that the world is okay, and you want to know what's happened. And news hosts, news anchors provide a valuable service. But I think what I'm doing is different, and I'm not telling you that this is all the news that's happening in the world and you need to know it. In fact, far from it. I'm taking the bits that I think are interesting, that I think you might find interesting, and talking about them. So I almost hesitate to call my show a news show in that sense, because I don't think it is.
Right. Hence the sort of complicated name I had for the genre of it, the description of what goes on in it. Right. But it's that sense of, how to put it, having stories on that interest you, that you think will interest the listener, it sounds considerably easier than it is, as I'm sure you would agree, to find where those circles overlap. And because, as well, a lot of times I'll be listening to the radio, any kind of radio, and there are few moments as dissatisfying as a listener one can have than when you realize, oh, they're trying to guess what interests me. No one can really, increasingly it's hard to guess that about anybody else, but I like to hear people who are talking with interest I'd rather hear somebody talking with interest about something, with their own genuine interest, than trying to guess what my interests are. Do you know what I mean? Like, I obviously am not in the demographic for, say, mommy bloggers, but I'd rather hear two mommy bloggers talk for 3 hours with interest about their mommy blogging than somebody who thinks, oh, here's a white 29-year-old male in Los Angeles. What are they like? You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's pandering.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Again, you're trying to catch the most amount of fish in your net. And what you're going to do is just be a bottom feeder, and you're not going to get the prettiest fish, right? You're not going to get the rare, golden mackerel or whatever it is.
Everybody wants the golden mackerel. How can you do, I don't understand how you develop the skills to successfully do a 5-minute interview. How is that possible? You do it, but I don't know how you do it. How can you get a conversation out of somebody in that short a span of time? It seems impossible to me, but you've had a lot of experience. Tell me how it's done.
Oh my gosh. It is a different arc. So I look at every interview, or try to look at every interview as an arc. And I think we talked earlier about stories and what makes a good story. So I think you can do that in a 5-minute interview, depending on how loquacious the guest is, hopefully.
So they could drop the ball, and then it's all on you.
Right. So you have to know when to hurry them along. So you start out with what are the, what's going on here? What's the basic nut of this story? I can do it right now if you want with you.
Sure.
Should I do a 5-minute interview with you?
Yes, let's do it. The listener deserves to hear a 5-minute interview with me.
5-minute interview with you.
Wait, it's 3:12:11. Okay. So we've got till 3:17:11.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So when did you first start your podcast?
I started, it was a public radio show in Santa Barbara for a while. In 2007, I'll say, it was a public radio show those first 4 years, and then after that came to Los Angeles, made it into a podcast-only sort of world traveling thing.
And what did you want to get out of it? What is the basic idea of the podcast? And
as it is now, as it's evolved to this
when
point.
You started.
Talked to people I wanted to talk to, writers I liked, academics, broadcasters, anybody, even a few KCRW hosts I talked to on that show. I wanted to talk to them, and I felt like I could do it. You know what? You just feel like you can do something. I feel like I can talk to people who I admire for an hour at a time. I acted on that impulse.
And you acted on that impulse because you thought that there would be an audience for that, or did you do it for your own edification, your own interests?
I think I was watching Charlie Rose one day, and I was like, I think I could talk to people. I think I could go long form too. Let's just see what happens. And then inertia set in after I started doing it, and ever since, 7 years later, I'm still doing it.
You've been doing it for 7 years.
Yeah, I think it's been about 7 years.
And what's been the hardest part of doing this? When you look back on your 7 years, was there a moment when you thought, I can't do this anymore, this has been too difficult? Or was there a particular interview that you found particularly thorny?
Well, if one is less pleasing than another, I always just assume I did something wrong. You know how that is? I mean, it's like, oh, maybe they were having a bad day, maybe I was having a bad day. But usually, for the vast majority out of hundreds, there's never been a problem. I'm always happy at the end. I'm always glad when I'm doing them. And it's never been like, I don't want to, even in the days when I was getting absolutely no money for it for those first 4 years, it wasn't like, I got to stop, because it seemed like, what else am I going to do?
So you weren't doing it for any monies. How are you earning your keep?
That's when I lived in Santa Barbara, and I worked still at the university that I graduated from at a sort of administrative job. But the sort of at that job, I kept doing it, and eventually I had to go out on the roof to breathe for half an hour at a time. I was so filled with self-loathing that I was doing that kind of job because I was like, Colin, what are you doing? You're not suited to this. But I was building up my interviewing skills over that time. So it wasn't time wasted.
Did anyone tell you, what are you doing? Stop it. Get a real job.
No. Does people do that these days? I feel like that's just something people are afraid people will say, right?
Were you ever afraid people would say that?
No, it never occurred to me. I figured, here's something I can do. I'll do it. And it's not like I was turning my back on a high-powered accountancy job, right? It was sort of like, here's something I can do. It's what I can think of that I can do. So I'll just do that in any avenue I can, and I'll keep going.
But did you ever worry 4 years you weren't being paid, whether this was the thing for you?
No, I guess not. I never did. It was just like, gotta keep, I didn't even think, well, if this doesn't work out, then I'll do something else, because there was no working out or not working out in my mind. It was just a continuous state of interviewing, finding more people to interview, interviewing, hour at a time, find the next person. And I was always excited to do it. So that was fuel on the fire, shall we say.
Who's your best interview?
Oh, I've interviewed, this goes to my favorite guests, because I've interviewed like the writer Pico Iyer, if you know him. He's a friend of mine. Through me interviewing
Santa
him.
Barbara.
Yeah, you see, that's where I met him, and I've had him on 3 times. Once in Santa Barbara, once in Los Angeles, once in Japan. Went to go visit him. So those 3 interviews over the years in different places, I think collectively that might be my favorite. But there's other people. There's guests you have over and over again. You sort of have a years-long conversation in some sense with them, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so. So when you look at what you're doing and you listen to the radio and your favorite radio shows, do you see similarities or do you see fundamental differences?
I haven't seen too many similarities. I feel like if I did, I would start changing what I did, because I was like, someone's already doing that, I guess my instinct has been to go away almost from the things I like, because the things I like already exist, right? If I listen to the Madeleine Brand show, that format, such as we can describe it, exists, and therefore I must do something else.
I see. So what do you want to do next? What's your next something else?
I've been expanding the show over the past few years, going around the world, Japan, but Mexico City, London, Copenhagen. I'm going to Toronto soon, Korea this summer for a month and a half, recording interviews. So the more far and wide I can take it, the better, and the more variety of conversation I can have. It's sort of just long-term goals are not my forte, as you can maybe sense.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you, Colin.
Well, thank you, Madeleine. Hey, 3:17:25. Excellent. I imagine, is 5 minutes a standard length for a segment? What are the segment lengths that you do, that you think in terms of?
Like 8 minutes, 7 to 8 minutes, usually for this show.
So it's not usually as short as 5.
No, but it obviously can be.
Right.
And I think you got a good sense of you, what you do for a living, why you're interested in it, and what your hopes are for the future. So I had a little arc in my mind of how I wanted to interview you and what I wanted to get out of that interview. And it started with the origins.
Right.
The middle part was all about the obstacles, and then the end was looking forward to the future. So it's a very simple 3-act interview. But
if you're going on this sort of arc of a life, I mean, someone is obviously always living a life, so you can start with that and sort of build upon it. You can say, well, I know this person was born and got to where they are now, and I know they're thinking they'll have something to do tomorrow and the day after. So it gives you something basic to work with, right?
Yeah. But you have to figure out what you want to focus on. I mean, I'm not going to ask you your entire life story in 5 minutes.
Yes.
So I just focused on the podcast in that particular 5-minute interview. We'll get to the other stuff. I mean, it's a little bit like therapy.
I see.
We'll get to your mother issues later.
I've never been in therapy, but I understand it's very popular in New York. Is it comparably popular here?
I think so. I think all of Pasadena is filled with therapists.
It is possible. Being here at KCRW, being at a new station, how much of a clean slate do you get when you go from one station to another? I mean, you've gone from media project to media project a bit in the last few years. Is it like a clean slate every time, or how do you look at you look at going from one thing to the next?
Well, I think it can't be an entirely clean slate because it's a very similar beast. It's still a media beast. It's still a 1-hour show. It's still, I'm hosting it. So there are a lot of similarities between Press Play and the Madeleine Brand show on KPCC. So, a clean slate? It can't be an entirely clean slate because I bring up my whole self and baggage and experience and interest to it. So it's not entirely clean. However, it's all different producers are working on it with their interests. And I don't want to say that this is just a show about me and my interests because a lot of the stories come from the producers and their interests. So it's shaped by them as much as it's shaped by me. So from that perspective, it's a new show. And they're all, with the exception of one, or two, they're younger than I am. So they have some of them are a lot younger than I am. So they have, really interesting takes on things that I wouldn't necessarily have.
And what sense can you get? I want to get an idea of doing a show like this or your previous one. What sense do you have of Angelenos are hearing you? How much do you hear? How much of a sort of vibe can you get back from Angelenos? Do you know what I mean? How much of a finger on the pulse can you have doing a show like this? Because of course the communication seems one way, but then again, you also have to be a bit of a reflector for them as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. It's a tough one. I don't know because I'm not talking to all of them, but we get a lot of feedback and we see which stories resonate, which stories don't resonate. I just hear from people that I run into in the community what stories they liked or who, but it's one of those things. I mean, it's kind of like, Steve Jobs and, I'm going to put myself in that category, but he said something like, people don't really know what they want. You have to give them what you think they want. And it turns out that then they want it. You can't, it's a fool's game to try to predict what people want. Right. You have to just rely on yourself and you have to be self-confident enough to say, I think that this is good. And I think you're going to think it's good too. So here it is.
Has there been an example of a sort of non-resonant story that you were sure would be resonant, but for some reason didn't hit people at the right angle?
Oh my gosh, all the time.
Really?
Yeah, there are tons of stories that I do that I mess up or I miss the mark, I think.
Well, I don't necessarily mean what do you fumble on, but like if it gets pulled off, a story that's pulled off to your mind satisfyingly, but one that just doesn't seem to ring the same way with everybody else. What can you learn from something like that?
Well, I guess it's hard to know because I don't, aside from a few people who decide to complain, I don't know exactly how it lands.
And complainers, I'll tell you a radio boss I had once. You can evaluate his advice, but it's a piece of what I've regarded as golden wisdom ever since I heard it from him. He said, somebody was a music station. He said, sometimes someone's going to call into the studio and complain, your format changed a bit. You're not playing my favorite song. Why are you playing that? That guy's just got a bad life. And you were the person he could call to vent his frustration. It's not about you. It's not really about the station. Something's wrong with the guy's life. And that guy's just got a bad life has echoed in my brain ever since. Whenever any complaint about anything has arisen, that guy's got a bad life. Do you think the bad life thing is really a factor or that major a factor in the sort of complaints one hears in media back from certain audience members?
Well, yeah, there's always the crank. Yeah, of course. There's always that. I think, though, I think that the listeners, if they don't like something, there's a good reason why they don't like it. Right. And that's fine. I don't like all the things that I listen to, and I'm quick to complain, maybe not write in, because people who write in, cranks. Yeah, no. Right. But seriously, if people
things to do.
people feel moved enough to write in, then I take what they say seriously, for sure. And I have learned a lot from the people who write in and have pointed out my errors or that there's another side of the story that I missed or whatever. I really welcome that. I would like more of it. As long as it's not ad hominem, it's not. And I think it's also oftentimes when women are on the air, they get attacked for things that men don't necessarily get attacked for. So you have to separate some of that stuff out of it. But, when it comes to the substance of disagreeing with how I pursued a certain topic, yeah, I think that's great. And I don't think it's because they have sad little lives.
I didn't say sad little, I said bad lives. Because I think...
Or bad lives.
I think when I complain about stuff myself, I feel like, is something else going wrong and I'm just talking about that? Maybe we're getting into therapy territory here, but I feel like about Los Angeles, people complain a lot about this city. And a lot of times I'll talk to them and I'll ask them, so why do you hate it here so much? Or if you hate it here, why do you live here? And they'll describe, they've just sort of, you can tell they haven't thought things through very well, so they have relegated themselves to a life that is complicatedly awful in many different ways in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles lets you do that. It's not going to stop you from making a hash of things, right?
Right. I agree that there are probably, maybe that person was hungry or had just been cut off by another car and was particularly angry when hearing the piece that I did. But I don't know. I mean, I take that into consideration too. But everything is related to everything else in a certain sense. But yeah, I mean, if it's a good, well-argued intellectual argument saying that this is wrong because of A, B, and C, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've had a bad day, but
that's true.
or that there's something going on psychologically with them. And that's another thing. It's like, I think there should be more of that in Los Angeles, and everyone's trying to get along and everything's all good and all that. Like, no, it's not all good.
So what would you like to see more of here in that vein?
Well, some more public discussion, more disagreements. And that's one thing I loved about New York is no one was afraid to say, I don't like this and here's why.
In what sort of a venue or where would people be airing this disagreement?
Well, on the radio, perhaps. That's a great place to
name one example.
That's one great example. I mean, what I love about LA is there is that sense of optimism and that sense of everything is, we're striving to make it better and we're not complaining. But at the same time, I think that there is a healthy way to complain, and it's a good thing because that's how you make change. Right. You don't make change by accepting the status quo and saying it's all great and fabulous because, a lot of
it's just as bad as complaining all the time.
Yeah, a lot of it isn't great and fabulous. And a lot of it could be improved. And sometimes that's the only way to do it is to say, you know what, this is wrong. And this is why.
What besides that, the lack of that, what do you want to see change here? What is broke in Los Angeles?
I will tell you, I'm knee deep in this right now because I'm doing a story on the legacy or the lack thereof of Brown versus Board of Education. And I have children one child in the public school system, and the inequality between public schools is shocking.
Between one public school and another.
Yeah. And it's all a factor of neighborhoods and which children get to go to which schools. And it breaks down along racial lines because racial lines often break down along economic lines. And, I see it up close in my day-to-day life and I see it professionally. The stratification between the rich and the poor and how it manifests itself in public education is unacceptable and it's shocking.
Is this a manifestation of or a sort of knock-on effect of the way Los Angeles geography tends to separate people as well? You see there's been so much writing about the way Los Angeles neighborhoods tend to distill down to one economic level, one race. Is the condition of the schools a result of that, where it's similar, it's based in that geography?
Yeah, a lot of it is. You've got rich neighborhoods and you have rich schools. Most of the Los Angeles public schools are minority and most are not wealthy. Most are poor. Most of the kids are on a free lunch or reduced price lunch. You don't see that when you go to certain neighborhoods where the schools are pretty wealthy, all things considered. And that's because the public investment in public education has diminished, and so the parents have to pick up the slack. And who can afford to do that?
Is it a problem that can be fixed on the level of schools, or is it something that needs to be addressed on a deeper level than schools?
Well, schools are pretty deep. I mean, it's a pretty thorny, big problem with schools. So I would start there. And sure, I mean, yeah, we could change our tax code and all that, but I can't do that. Most people can't do that. What they can do is try to make their public schools a little more equitable. So there are lots of ways, lots of ideas out there to do that. And I would welcome anyone to try to do that, because I think that it's vitally important. More than 600,000 children go to LA public schools, and most of them are substandard.
And here is an example of where your interest comes in. I mean, getting a complicated situation like this broken down and explained on the radio is not only a good step, but a necessary one, it seems to me. I mean, what more efficient way is there to make a problem like this understandable? And if you can't make it understandable, nothing's going to happen, right?
Right. I mean, that is the function of the media, is to start these conversations. Hopefully, to be one, I don't know, one chair leg in the public discussion over our public policy and our democracy, not to be too highfalutin about it, but, people need to know what's happening before they can do something. And they find out about things on the radio or in the other media. Happily, I have a way to talk to other people about what's happening. So that's a great honor and a privilege.
Finally, when you have a segment like that on your show, a serious segment breaking down a serious problem, it's in some sense educating people and empowering them as well. What do you balance that out with on the other end? What goofy thing best offsets that later in the show, or indeed earlier?
Well, today we had a prime example of that. We did a little piece to end the show, a little piece of dessert about Smokey Bear. Sure. The Forest Service mascot. He's 70 years old, if you can believe that.
Looks good.
Yeah, he looks really in shape. And he doesn't wear a shirt, so he's showing it off.
Bold.
And we had a fun little interview about that, and I ended it by asking if it's Smokey Bear or Smokey the Bear.
Oh, that's a good point.
Isn't it? A good question.
Right.
It's a deep, deep question.
Should we say what it is, or should people need to look up your show to find that out?
Yeah, maybe listen to the show and find out.
You can listen to that show on KCRW.org. It is a press play with Madeleine Brand, a beloved Los Angeles radio personality. Madeleine, thanks so much.
Well, thank you. The pleasure's been mine.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall, and you can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.